Standing in the marble hallway of Suffolk County Probate Court, I clutched the legal documents that would determine my entire future. My hands trembled as Janet Cromwell, my parents' shark of a lawyer, approached with that predatory smile I'd grown to despise over the past 6 months. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same two people who had abandoned me at 16 were now claiming I had manipulated a dying billionaire. Through the heavy oak doors, I could see Marcus and Patricia sitting confidently at the plaintiff's table, whispering strategies with their legal team. As the bailiff called our case, I whispered a silent prayer to Grandpa Theodore's memory and stepped into the courtroom that would decide whether love or greed would prevail. Growing up as the daughter of Marcus and Patricia Chen felt like living in a house made of glass, beautiful from the outside but cold and fragile within. My parents owned a mid-level marketing firm called Stellar Communications, constantly chasing the next big client or social event that might elevate their status in Boston's competitive business scene. While other kids had bedtime stories, I had nannies who rotated every few months because my parents couldn't be bothered to maintain consistent childcare. Marcus spent his days networking at country clubs and his evenings reviewing contracts that promised more than they delivered. Patricia filled her schedule with charity galas and shopping trips, always photographing herself for social media, but never quite achieving the influence she desperately craved. They lived paycheck to paycheck, despite their 6-figure incomes, constantly borrowing money they never intended to repay. When I turned 16, they made their priorities crystal clear. Instead of celebrating my birthday, they announced I would be attending Worthington Preparatory Academy, a boarding school 300 miles away in Vermont. The decision wasn't about providing me with better education, but about removing the inconvenience of having a teenager around their carefully curated lifestyle. That summer, feeling completely abandoned, I called the one person who had always made time for me. Grandpa Theodore answered on the second ring, his warm Greek accent wrapping around my name like a hug I desperately needed. Within hours, I was on a train to Martha's Vineyard, watching the Massachusetts coastline blur past my window as I traveled toward the only person who truly understood me. Theodore Martinelli had built his fortune through sheer determination and an immigrant's work ethic. He arrived from Crete in 1952 with $17 and a vocabulary of maybe 50 English words. By the time I knew him, he controlled a real estate empire spanning 5 states and had diversified into technology investments that seemed to turn everything he touched into gold. But what made Grandpa special wasn't his wealth. It was his wisdom. During those precious summer weeks at his Martha's Vineyard estate, he taught me about life through simple moments that became treasured memories. We'd wake before dawn to fish off his private dock, the morning mist rising from Vineyard Sound, while he shared stories of his youth in Greece. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of construction work before he became a mogul, would gently guide mine as I learned to bait hooks and read the water. Our conversations during those early morning fishing trips shaped my understanding of what really mattered in life. He spoke about his first job in America digging ditches for a construction company where his supervisor mocked his accent and paid him half what the other workers earned. Instead of becoming bitter, he studied English at night school and saved every penny until he could buy his first small apartment building. My parents' relationship with Grandpa Theodore was transactional at best. They'd appear for major holidays, always arriving late and leaving early, treating his home like a pit stop rather than a family gathering. During Christmas dinners, Marcus would dominate conversations with updates about Stellar Communications' latest supposed successes, while Patricia would compliment Grandpa's housekeeper's cooking, but never offer to help serve or clean. Over the years, I watched my parents borrow increasingly large sums from Grandpa Theodore. First, it was $10,000 to cover a cash flow problem at their business, then $25,000 for a marketing campaign that promised huge returns but delivered nothing. Eventually, they were asking for $50,000 loans to maintain their lifestyle when clients delayed payments or contracts fell through. Grandpa never refused their requests, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes each time they asked for money without offering updates on previous loans. He kept meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger, noting every transaction with dates, amounts, and purposes. When I asked him once why he kept lending to them, he smiled sadly and said that sometimes love means giving people enough rope to either climb higher or hang themselves with their own choices. During my college years at Columbia University, where I studied nonprofit management with Grandpa's financial support, the distance between my parents and me grew even wider. They attended my graduation ceremony but spent the entire reception networking with other families instead of celebrating my achievements. When I told them about my plans to work in elder care advocacy, Patricia rolled her eyes and suggested I reconsider something more profitable. Meanwhile, Grandpa Theodore became my mentor and closest confidant. He supported my internships at nursing homes and community centers, understanding that my passion for helping elderly people stemmed from the love and wisdom he'd shared with me throughout my childhood. When I struggled with difficult coursework or relationship problems, he was always available for long phone conversations that left me feeling grounded and hopeful. 3 months before his death, I discovered something that would change everything. While visiting Grandpa for his 81st birthday celebration, I accidentally overheard a phone conversation between my parents that chilled me to the bone. They were standing in his kitchen, apparently forgetting that voices carry through the old house's thin walls. Marcus was speaking in hushed tones about waiting for the old man to finally die so they could contest whatever ridiculous will he'd probably written. Patricia laughed and agreed that Sofia had probably manipulated him into leaving her something significant, but that any decent lawyer could prove undue influence by a conniving granddaughter who spent too much time with a lonely widower. The recording I made on my phone that night would become crucial evidence, though my lawyer David Chen advised patience before revealing this devastating proof of their true intentions. As I listened to my own parents discuss my grandfather's death like a business opportunity and my character like a criminal case study, I realized that the family dysfunction I'd experienced my entire life was about to explode into something far more destructive than I'd ever imagined. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October while I was reviewing applications for a community outreach program in Boston. Grandpa Theodore had suffered a massive heart attack in his study, surrounded by the leather-bound books he'd collected throughout his journey from poverty to prosperity. The housekeeper found him peacefully slumped over his desk, his reading glasses still perched on his nose, and a biography of Alexander the Great open beside his coffee cup. His funeral filled St. Mary's Cathedral with an extraordinary mix of business leaders, community activists, former employees, and elderly residents from local nursing homes who remembered his quiet acts of kindness. I delivered the eulogy sharing stories about fishing trips and life lessons while my parents sat stone-faced in the front pew, already calculating their expectations for the will reading scheduled for the following week. Morrison Blackwell and Associates occupied an entire floor of a sleek downtown Boston high-rise, their conference room decorated with expensive artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Harrison Blackwell, the senior partner who'd handled Grandpa Theodore's legal affairs for 30 years, arranged the will reading with theatrical precision that matched the gravity of the moment. My parents arrived dressed in their finest funeral attire, Marcus, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and Patricia draped in black designer clothing that screamed expensive grief. They chose seats directly across from Harrison's mahogany desk, positioning themselves like royalty expecting their due inheritance. When Harrison began reading the will, his voice carried the weight of legal authority mixed with personal respect for his deceased client. The document was comprehensive, detailing assets that included real estate holdings in Massachusetts, New York, Florida, California, and Texas, plus technology investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, art collections spanning 3 centuries, and rare book libraries that universities would kill to acquire. But as Harrison continued reading, my parents' confident expressions gradually transformed into confusion, then disbelief, and finally pure rage. Theodore Martinelli had left his entire $3 billion estate to his granddaughter Sofia, along with specific instructions for establishing charitable foundations and educational scholarships that would honor his immigrant journey and commitment to helping others achieve the American dream. Marcus and Patricia received nothing except a letter that Harrison read aloud in the same measured tone he'd used for the legal portions of the will. Grandpa Theodore's final message to his son and daughter-in-law was a masterpiece of disappointed love, detailing their financial irresponsibility, emotional abandonment of their daughter, and repeated disrespect toward the man who'd tried to guide them toward better choices. The letter mentioned specific incidents that I'd never known about, including times when my parents had criticized Grandpa's Greek heritage at social functions, complained about his accent, embarrassing them in front of their friends, and made jokes about old world values being outdated in modern America. He'd recorded every slight, every ungrateful moment, every instance when they'd treated his generosity like an entitlement rather than a gift. My shock was genuine and overwhelming. I'd expected perhaps the Martha's Vineyard house, or maybe a small trust fund to help with my nonprofit career. The reality of inheriting everything seemed impossible to process, like winning a lottery I'd never entered. Harrison explained the ironclad nature of the will drafted by some of the most experienced estate lawyers in New England and structured to prevent any successful challenges. But my parents were already planning their attack. Patricia's tears of grief instantly transformed into tears of fury as she accused me of manipulating a vulnerable old man who'd lost his mental capacity in his final years. Marcus pounded the conference table and demanded that Harrison explain how a granddaughter could possibly inherit everything, while the biological son received nothing. Janet Cromwell entered the story at this point, a notorious inheritance litigation specialist whose reputation for aggressive tactics and questionable ethics made her the perfect weapon for parents desperate enough to destroy their own daughter's future. She'd built her career on contested wills and family warfare, charging enormous fees for services that often left families permanently destroyed but generated massive billable hours. As we left the law office that day, Janet was already strategizing with my parents about challenging Grandpa Theodore's mental competency, claiming undue influence, and painting me as a master manipulator who'd isolated an elderly man from his real family. Their confidence was both terrifying and revealing, suggesting they'd been planning this legal assault long before Grandpa's death. That evening, I sat alone in my small apartment, surrounded by legal documents that would change my life forever. The weight of inheriting such massive wealth felt crushing rather than celebratory. Grandpa Theodore had entrusted me with his life's work, his values, and his hope for making the world better. But first, I would have to survive the battle that my own parents were about to wage against everything he'd believed about family love and character. The most devastating revelation came 2 weeks later, when David Chen, the inheritance law specialist I'd hired to defend the will, discovered that my parents had been secretly meeting with Janet Cromwell for 6 months before Grandpa Theodore's death. They'd been so confident in their legal strategy that they'd already borrowed against their house to pay retainer fees and court costs. Their lawsuit wasn't a reaction to grief or disappointment. It was a calculated business decision based on their assumption that blood relationship would trump demonstrated love and character in any legal proceeding. Suffolk County Probate Court became the battlefield where my family's dysfunction would be dissected under fluorescent lights and legal scrutiny. Judge Margaret O'Brien presided over inheritance disputes with a reputation for cutting through emotional manipulation to focus on facts and evidence. Her courtroom was a study in judicial efficiency with polished wood benches, American flags flanking her elevated desk, and windows that looked out over Boston Harbor, where Grandpa Theodore had first glimpsed his new homeland 73 years earlier. David Chen transformed from a recommended lawyer into my strategic lifeline, a brilliant legal mind who specialized in defending legitimate wills against frivolous challenges. His office walls displayed diplomas from Harvard Law School and photographs with grateful clients who'd survived family warfare similar to what I was now facing. During our first meeting, he explained that inheritance litigation often brought out the absolute worst in people, turning love into greed and relationships into evidence for courtroom battles. My parents' lawsuit read like a fictional thriller designed to destroy my reputation and character. They claimed I'd moved into Grandpa Theodore's Martha's Vineyard estate during his final year, controlling his daily routine and isolating him from family members who truly cared about his welfare. According to their legal filings, I'd manipulated his medications to keep him confused and dependent, while gradually turning him against his own son through lies and emotional manipulation. Every allegation was meticulously crafted to paint me as a conniving opportunist who'd preyed upon an elderly man's loneliness and declining mental capacity. They suggested I'd forged documents, recorded private conversations without permission, and used my knowledge of his immigrant background to make him believe I was the only family member who truly understood his values and experiences. The discovery process revealed the shocking extent of their preparation for this legal assault. Private investigators had followed me for months, photographing my visits to nursing homes and community centers, while building a case that I was practicing some kind of elder manipulation on multiple vulnerable victims. They'd interviewed former classmates, co-workers, and even ex-boyfriends, searching for any evidence of manipulative behavior that could support their undue influence claims. Most disturbing was their systematic campaign to turn extended family members against me. Cousins I'd barely spoken to since childhood were suddenly posting social media messages about greedy relatives who took advantage of elderly family members. Aunts and uncles received carefully crafted phone calls suggesting that Sofia had brainwashed their father into believing his own son didn't love him. Janet Cromwell orchestrated this character assassination with professional precision, understanding that inheritance litigation required more than legal arguments. It demanded the complete destruction of the beneficiary's credibility and moral standing. Her strategy involved presenting my genuine love for Grandpa Theodore as evidence of calculated manipulation, turning every shared memory into proof of undue influence. During depositions, I learned about conversations I'd never known happened. 6 months before his death, my parents had approached Grandpa Theodore's personal physician, Dr. Marcus Steinberg, requesting a mental competency evaluation based on their concerns about his decision-making abilities. They'd suggested that his choice to support my nonprofit career instead of their business ventures indicated cognitive decline and poor judgment. Dr. Steinberg had refused their request and filed a formal report documenting their suspicious behavior and apparent financial motivations. The report noted that Theodore Martinelli was mentally sharp, physically healthy for his age, and fully capable of making informed decisions about his estate and personal relationships. More importantly, the doctor had documented my parents' obvious focus on financial inheritance rather than medical welfare. This sealed report became David Chen's secret weapon, though getting it unsealed required multiple court motions and legal arguments about relevance to the current case. When Judge O'Brien finally allowed the medical records into evidence, they revealed the premeditated nature of my parents' challenge to Grandpa's mental capacity and their complete lack of genuine concern for his health or happiness. The trial date was set for March 15th, giving both sides several months to prepare their cases and gather additional evidence. During this period, I struggled with the emotional weight of being legally attacked by my own parents while trying to honor Grandpa Theodore's memory and continue the nonprofit work that had always given my life meaning and purpose. My parents, meanwhile, appeared energized by the legal battle, attending strategy sessions with Janet Cromwell and making public statements about fighting for family justice against ungrateful children who abandoned their moral obligations. They framed their lawsuit as protecting elderly Americans from manipulation by opportunistic relatives, positioning themselves as heroic advocates rather than greedy plaintiffs. The months leading up to trial became a period of intense preparation and emotional testing. David Chen worked tirelessly to document the genuine relationship between Grandpa Theodore and me, collecting photographs, correspondence, and witness testimonies that proved our bond was based on love, respect, and shared values rather than financial calculation. But the most challenging aspect of this period was confronting the reality that my own parents were willing to destroy me publicly to get money they'd never earned. Their lawsuit wasn't just about inheritance, it was about their complete rejection of everything Grandpa Theodore had tried to teach about family character and the responsibility that comes with wealth and privilege. The trial began on a cold March morning, with Suffolk County Probate Court packed beyond capacity. Local media had picked up the story of the billionaire's inheritance dispute, turning our family tragedy into public entertainment. I sat beside David Chen at the defendant's table, trying to project confidence while my stomach churned with anticipation and dread. Janet Cromwell's opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, designed to transform my parents from greedy plaintiffs into grieving victims. She portrayed Marcus and Patricia as devoted children who'd been systematically alienated from their beloved father by a calculating granddaughter who understood exactly how to exploit an elderly immigrant's nostalgia and loneliness. According to Janet's narrative, I'd spent years studying Grandpa Theodore's psychological vulnerabilities, learning his stories about Greece and his immigrant journey, then using that knowledge to make him believe I was the only family member who truly understood his experiences. She claimed I'd isolated him from his son and daughter-in-law by convincing him they were ashamed of his accent and heritage, creating divisions that never existed before my manipulation. Her description of my supposed crimes was both detailed and fictional, painting me as someone who'd moved into his home under the pretense of caring for him while actually controlling his medication schedule, monitoring his phone calls, and gradually rewriting his will to benefit myself. Every kindness I'd shown Grandpa became evidence of calculation, every shared memory proof of psychological manipulation. David Chen's opening statement took a completely different approach, focusing on documented evidence rather than emotional appeals. He presented a timeline of genuine relationship building, supported by photographs, letters, and witness testimonies that proved my bond with Grandpa Theodore was authentic and based on mutual respect and shared values. His strategy involved methodically dismantling each of my parents' claims with concrete evidence, while demonstrating their pattern of financial irresponsibility and emotional neglect. Instead of attacking their character, he let their own actions speak through bank records, loan documents, and recorded conversations that revealed their true priorities and motivations. Marcus took the witness stand, first presenting himself as a successful businessman who'd always maintained a close relationship with his father despite demanding work schedules. His testimony was polished and rehearsed, claiming weekly visits to the Martha's Vineyard estate and regular phone conversations about family matters and business decisions. But David Chen's cross-examination revealed the fiction behind these claims. Phone records showed that Marcus had called his father only 12 times during the entire year before his death, with most conversations lasting less than 5 minutes. Credit card statements proved he'd charged expensive dinners and hotel stays to business accounts during supposed visits to Martha's Vineyard, suggesting he was using family time as tax-deductible business entertainment. Most damaging was the revelation that Marcus had borrowed over $200,000 from Grandpa Theodore during the past decade, with promissory notes that were never honored and repayment schedules that were completely ignored. David Chen presented a ledger showing that Marcus treated his father like a personal bank, requesting loans for business investments that consistently failed to generate promised returns. Patricia's testimony was even more theatrical, complete with tears and emotional breakdowns, as she described watching her father slip away from his family due to Sofia's influence. She claimed that family gatherings became uncomfortable because I would correct Grandpa's stories or contradict his memories, making him feel confused and dependent on my version of events. Her performance might have been convincing if not for the evidence that contradicted every major claim. Video recordings from family Christmas dinners showed Patricia arriving late, leaving early, and spending most gatherings on her phone, handling business calls rather than engaging with Grandpa Theodore. Photographs revealed her boredom and impatience during family meals, often checking her watch or discussing departure times while Grandpa was still talking. The character witnesses Janet Cromwell presented for my parents were a collection of paid consultants and distant relatives who barely knew our family dynamics. Their testimonies were general and vague, focusing on Marcus and Patricia's public personas rather than their private behavior toward Grandpa Theodore. Judge O'Brien's skepticism became increasingly apparent as the trial progressed. She interrupted several witnesses to ask for specific evidence supporting their claims, demanded documentation for allegations about my behavior, and questioned the credibility of testimonies that seemed rehearsed rather than genuine. The turning point came when Janet Cromwell presented what she claimed was a secret recording of me manipulating Grandpa Theodore about his will. The audio allegedly captured me, suggesting that Marcus and Patricia only visited when they needed money and didn't truly care about his welfare or legacy. But David Chen had prepared for exactly this type of desperate move. His audio expert, Dr. Jennifer Walsh from MIT's Media Laboratory, took the stand to explain how the recording had been heavily edited, using sophisticated software to splice together different conversations and create dialogue that never actually occurred. Dr. Walsh's analysis revealed at least 17 separate edit points, where conversations had been combined, words taken out of context, and responses moved to different questions. The recording wasn't just misleading, it was essentially a work of fiction created from legitimate conversations that had been manipulated to support false claims. Judge O'Brien's response to this revelation was swift and severe. She threatened sanctions against the plaintiffs for presenting fabricated evidence and warned Janet Cromwell about the ethical implications of using falsified recordings in legal proceedings. The courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically as spectators and media representatives realized they were witnessing attempted fraud rather than legitimate litigation. That evening, I sat in David Chen's office reviewing the day's testimony and preparing for my own time on the witness stand. The fabricated recording had backfired spectacularly, but I knew that my testimony would be the crucial moment when the jury and judge would decide whether to believe the evidence of genuine love or the fiction of calculated manipulation. Taking the witness stand felt like stepping into an arena where my entire life would be examined under the harshest possible light. David Chen had prepared me for aggressive cross-examination, but nothing could fully ready me for the emotional challenge of defending my relationship with the most important person in my life against attacks from my own parents. I began by describing my childhood relationship with Grandpa Theodore, focusing on specific memories that demonstrated our genuine bond. I talked about learning to fish in the early morning hours when mist rose from Vineyard Sound, listening to his stories about arriving in America with $17 and the determination to build a better life for his family. Those fishing trips weren't about inheritance or manipulation. They were about a lonely teenager finding wisdom and unconditional love from a grandfather who understood what it meant to feel like an outsider. He taught me to read water currents and weather patterns, but more importantly, he showed me how to navigate life's challenges with integrity and compassion. I described our conversations about his immigrant experience, how he'd worked construction jobs where supervisors mocked his accent and paid him half wages while he studied English at night school. These weren't stories designed to manipulate his emotions. They were life lessons about perseverance and dignity that shaped my understanding of what really mattered in life. When David Chen asked about my parents' financial relationship with Grandpa Theodore, I presented evidence that told a devastating story of exploitation and ingratitude. Bank records showed they'd borrowed over $400,000 during the past 15 years, with promissory notes that were treated like suggestions rather than legal obligations. I testified about watching my parents ask for loans during family gatherings, always framing their requests as temporary business needs that would be repaid with interest once their latest venture succeeded. But their businesses never generated the promised returns, and the loans were never repaid, creating a pattern that resembled theft more than family assistance. The most painful part of my testimony involved describing my parents' emotional abandonment throughout my childhood and teenage years. I detailed how they'd chosen boarding school not for my education, but for their convenience, how they'd missed important milestones because business obligations always took priority over family responsibilities. I presented photographs from my high school graduation where my parents spent the entire reception networking with other families instead of celebrating my achievements. Credit card records showed they'd left immediately after the ceremony to attend a business conference in New York, making it clear that my education was less important than their professional ambitions. When I played the secretly recorded conversation where my parents discussed waiting for the old man to die, the courtroom fell silent except for the scratchy audio quality that made their callous words even more chilling. Marcus's voice clearly stated that Sofia had probably manipulated their father into leaving her something significant, but any decent lawyer could prove undue influence by a conniving granddaughter. Patricia's laughter in response to these comments was perhaps the most damning evidence of their true character, revealing people who viewed their father's death as a business opportunity and their daughter's relationship with him as a criminal conspiracy worthy of legal challenge. But the most powerful part of my testimony came when I described Grandpa Theodore's mental sharpness and independence during his final years. I presented evidence of his continued business activities, including successful real estate investments and technology portfolio management that generated millions of dollars in profits right up until his death. I testified about our final conversation 3 days before his heart attack, when he'd called to discuss his plans for expanding scholarship programs and establishing new charitable foundations. His voice was strong and his thinking clear as he outlined specific goals for helping immigrant families and supporting elder care facilities that served low-income communities. Dr. Steinberg's medical records supported my testimony about Grandpa's mental capacity, showing regular checkups that found him physically healthy and cognitively sharp. The doctor's notes specifically mentioned Theodore's excitement about Sofia's nonprofit work and his plans for using his wealth to support causes that aligned with his values and life experiences. Janet Cromwell's cross-examination was brutal but ultimately ineffective. She tried to portray my volunteer work at nursing homes as practice for manipulating elderly victims, suggesting I'd learned psychological techniques for gaining trust and influence over vulnerable seniors. But her attacks only highlighted my genuine commitment to elder care advocacy and my pattern of helping people who reminded me of my beloved grandfather. She questioned my motives for spending so much time with an elderly man instead of pursuing typical activities for someone my age, implying there was something unnatural about a granddaughter who enjoyed fishing trips and conversation with her grandfather. But these attacks only reinforced the genuine nature of our relationship and the shallow priorities that guided my parents' definition of normal family behavior. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Judge O'Brien suddenly asked me to approach the bench alone, without lawyers or court reporters present. Her request surprised everyone in the courtroom, including David Chen, who had no idea why the judge wanted a private conversation with his client. Judge O'Brien's voice was quiet but intense as she asked if I remembered volunteering at Sunset Manor Nursing Home 3 years earlier. I confirmed that I'd spent several months reading to patients and organizing activities for residents who rarely receive visitors from their families. She then revealed that I'd read to her own mother during the final months of her life, sitting beside her bed twice weekly to share mystery novels and organize birthday celebrations for forgotten residents. Judge O'Brien had visited her mother during one of my reading sessions, but hadn't introduced herself, choosing instead to observe how I interacted with patients who had no idea their visitor was connected to anyone important. Her mother had mentioned the kind young woman who brought homemade cookies and stayed late to comfort residents who felt abandoned by their families. Judge O'Brien remembered thinking that this volunteer demonstrated the kind of character that reflected genuine compassion rather than calculated kindness designed to impress observers or gain advantage. This revelation changed the entire atmosphere in the courtroom, though Judge O'Brien was careful to explain that her personal knowledge wouldn't influence her legal judgment, but it provided context for understanding my character that went beyond the evidence presented by either side, demonstrating a pattern of genuine care for elderly people that had nothing to do with inheritance or financial gain. As I returned to my seat after this private conversation, I could see my parents' expressions shifting from confidence to concern. They realized that their strategy of portraying me as a manipulative opportunist was crumbling under the weight of evidence that proved exactly the opposite about my character and motivations. Judge Margaret O'Brien's revelation about our previous connection sent shockwaves through the courtroom, but her handling of this information demonstrated exactly why she was respected for her judicial integrity and commitment to legal fairness. She immediately called both legal teams to the bench for a private conference, explaining her prior knowledge and offering to recuse herself if either side felt her objectivity might be compromised. David Chen and Janet Cromwell both declined the recusal option, understanding that Judge O'Brien's reputation for fairness was legendary and that her personal knowledge actually supported the evidence already presented rather than contradicting the legal arguments. Her recognition of my character provided additional context, but didn't change the fundamental facts about my relationship with Grandpa Theodore or my parents' pattern of financial exploitation. When court resumed, Judge O'Brien addressed the unusual situation with remarkable transparency, explaining to the jury and courtroom observers that she'd recognized me as a volunteer who had read to her mother at Sunset Manor Nursing Home 3 years earlier. She emphasized that this recognition supported rather than replaced the evidence already presented, providing an independent witness to my character that predated any inheritance considerations. Her description of my volunteer work was both moving and relevant to the case at hand. She explained how I'd arrived at Sunset Manor twice weekly for 6 months, bringing homemade cookies and mystery novels to read to residents who rarely received visitors from their own families. My interactions with confused dementia patients demonstrated patience and genuine compassion that couldn't be faked or calculated for personal advantage. Judge O'Brien's mother had specifically mentioned the young woman who organized birthday celebrations for forgotten residents, staying late into the evening to comfort people who felt abandoned by children and grandchildren too busy to visit. These acts of kindness occurred when no one important was watching, and no financial benefit could possibly result from such dedicated service. The judge's careful legal reasoning separated her personal knowledge from the evidence presented during trial, but the combination created an overwhelming picture of someone whose character was fundamentally inconsistent with the manipulative opportunist described in my parents' lawsuit. Her observations provided independent corroboration for the pattern of genuine compassion that defined my relationship with Grandpa Theodore. Her systematic destruction of my parents' claims was methodical and devastating. She addressed the undue influence allegations by noting that Theodore Martinelli had maintained independent business activities and professional relationships right up until his death, demonstrating mental capacity that was inconsistent with the cognitive vulnerability required for successful manipulation. She examined the evidence of our relationship timeline, noting that my bond with Grandpa Theodore had developed over decades rather than during a suspicious final year when his mental capacity might have been compromised. The consistency of our interactions, supported by photographs, correspondence, and witness testimonies, proved genuine affection rather than calculated influence. Judge O'Brien's analysis of the financial evidence was particularly damning for my parents' case. She noted that Marcus and Patricia had borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars without repayment, while I had never requested or received financial assistance beyond educational support that was freely offered and gratefully accepted. The pattern of my parents' behavior toward their father revealed people who viewed him as a resource to be exploited rather than a family member deserving respect and gratitude. Their lawsuit represented a continuation of this exploitative relationship, demanding inheritance they'd never earned through service sacrifice or demonstrated love. Her examination of the fabricated recording incident led to severe criticism of Janet Cromwell's legal tactics and ethical standards. Judge O'Brien noted that presenting falsified evidence wasn't just illegal. It demonstrated a complete disregard for truth and justice that undermined the entire foundation of legal proceedings. The judge's order was comprehensive and decisive, validating Theodore Martinelli's will in its entirety while rejecting every claim presented by Marcus and Patricia. She ordered them to pay all court costs and legal fees, noting that frivolous lawsuits designed to harass legitimate beneficiaries represented an abuse of the legal system that deserved financial consequences. Her warning about future legal action was stern and specific, noting that any appeal would need to present substantial new evidence rather than recycled claims that had been thoroughly debunked during trial. She emphasized that inheritance litigation required genuine legal basis rather than disappointment about testamentary decisions made by mentally competent adults. As Judge O'Brien delivered her verdict, my parents' confident expressions transformed into shock and rage. Marcus pounded the plaintiff's table, while Patricia began crying tears of fury rather than grief, their true characters finally revealed under the stress of complete legal defeat. Their dramatic exit from the courtroom was witnessed by media representatives and court observers who'd followed the trial from beginning to end. Patricia screamed that this wasn't over and threatened immediate appeals, but her threats rang hollow, given the comprehensive nature of their defeat and the financial implications of continuing their legal assault. David Chen's revelation about my parents' bankruptcy was the final twist that made their threats meaningless. His investigation had uncovered that Marcus and Patricia had borrowed against their house to pay legal fees and court costs, confident that a successful lawsuit would generate enough money to cover their debts and fund their lifestyle indefinitely. Their financial irresponsibility had finally caught up with them in the most dramatic way possible. They'd gambled everything on a lawsuit that not only failed, but resulted in additional financial obligations they couldn't possibly meet. The house they'd mortgaged to fund their legal attack would now be lost to foreclosure, leaving them with nothing except the consequences of their greed and poor judgment. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. Justice had been served, but the cost was the complete destruction of any remaining relationship with my biological parents. Their choice to attack me legally, rather than accept their father's final judgment, had burned bridges that could never be rebuilt. But Grandpa Theodore's legacy was secure, and his trust in my character had been validated by legal proceedings that tested every aspect of our relationship. The inheritance he'd left me came with enormous responsibility, but also with the satisfaction of knowing that his final wishes would be honored by someone who truly understood his values and commitment to using wealth for helping others achieve their dreams. The months following the trial verdict brought both overwhelming responsibility and unexpected opportunities for healing that I'd never imagined possible. Grandpa Theodore's $3 billion inheritance wasn't just money. It was a sacred trust that carried the weight of his immigrant dreams and his lifetime commitment to using success for lifting others toward their own achievements. My first major decision involved establishing the Theodore Martinelli Foundation with an initial endowment of $50 million, focused specifically on elder care advocacy and educational opportunities for first-generation college students. The Foundation's mission statement reflected Grandpa's core values, honoring the wisdom of elderly Americans while providing pathways for young people to transform their families' economic circumstances through education and hard work. The Martha's Vineyard Estate became the Foundation's headquarters and retreat center, transformed from a private home into a welcoming space where families dealing with elder care challenges could find resources, support, and respite from the emotional and financial stresses of caring for aging relatives. The fishing dock where Grandpa and I had shared countless conversations became a meditation garden where visitors could reflect on their own relationships with elderly family members. Creating scholarship programs required careful planning to ensure Grandpa's money would support students who truly embodied his values of determination and character. The Martinelli Scholars Program provided full college funding for students pursuing degrees in nonprofit management, gerontology, social work, and healthcare advocacy, with additional mentoring support to help them navigate academic challenges and career development. But the most emotionally significant project was renovating Sunset Manor Nursing Home, where I'd volunteered and where Judge O'Brien's mother had spent her final months. The facility desperately needed updated equipment, expanded programming, and additional staff to provide dignified care for residents whose families couldn't afford premium facilities. The renovation project included creating a library stocked with large print books, establishing a computer center where residents could video chat with distant relatives, and hiring additional activities coordinators to organize events that would combat the loneliness and depression that plagued so many elderly Americans living in institutional settings. My emotional visit to Grandpa Theodore's grave at Mount Auburn Cemetery became a turning point in processing both my grief and my determination to honor his legacy appropriately. Standing beside his headstone, which bore the simple inscription, "Theodore Martinelli, beloved father and grandfather who taught us that love is action," I made promises that would guide my stewardship of his wealth and values. I promised to use his money wisely, focusing on programs that would create lasting change rather than temporary charity. I promised to remember his immigrant journey and support other families struggling to achieve the American dream. Most importantly, I promised to demonstrate the kind of character he'd seen in me, proving worthy of the trust he'd placed in my hands. But the most challenging aspect of moving forward involved deciding how to respond to my parents' complete financial and social destruction. The bankruptcy proceedings following their legal defeat had stripped away their house, their business, and most of their personal possessions. Marcus and Patricia were living in a small rental apartment, working temporary jobs to cover basic expenses, while dealing with the social humiliation of their very public court defeat. Their situation presented both an opportunity for revenge and a test of the values Grandpa Theodore had tried to instill in me throughout our relationship. I could have ignored their suffering, viewing their financial ruin as just consequences for their attempt to destroy my reputation and steal money they'd never earned through genuine love or service. Instead, I chose a path that honored both justice and compassion, offering my parents a chance at redemption that required genuine change rather than simple forgiveness. I wrote them a carefully crafted letter, explaining my willingness to help them rebuild their lives, but only if they demonstrated real commitment to personal growth and service to others. My offer to Marcus involved a position managing financial oversight for the Theodore Martinelli Foundation, with a modest but livable salary contingent upon his completion of addiction counseling and financial responsibility training. His gambling problems and poor money management had contributed to their financial difficulties, and any future role in foundation work would require demonstrated skills and ethical standards. Patricia's opportunity involved coordinating volunteer programs at Sunset Manor and other elder care facilities supported by foundation grants. Her background in marketing could be valuable for recruiting volunteers and organizing community outreach, but only if she committed to genuine service rather than treating volunteer coordination as a stepping stone to more prestigious positions. Both positions came with strict conditions that reflected Grandpa Theodore's values about earning trust through demonstrated character, rather than claiming privilege through family relationships. They would need to complete 6 months of community service before being considered for paid positions, proving their commitment to helping others rather than simply recovering their previous lifestyle. Their response to my letter was initially mixed, with Marcus expressing gratitude, while Patricia struggled with accepting help that came with conditions and expectations, rather than unconditional financial support. but their desperate circumstances eventually motivated both of them to begin the personal growth work required for potential reconciliation. Marcus's journey through addiction counseling revealed gambling debts and poor financial decisions that had contributed significantly to their family's dysfunction and eventual bankruptcy. His willingness to address these problems honestly represented the first time I'd seen him take responsibility for consequences, rather than blaming external circumstances. Patricia's volunteer work at Sunset Manor was transformative in ways none of us had expected. Her first interactions with elderly residents were stilted and obviously uncomfortable, but gradually she began developing genuine relationships with people whose life experiences reminded her of her own father-in-law's immigrant journey. Working with residents who felt abandoned by their families helped Patricia understand how her treatment of Grandpa Theodore had contributed to his decision to prioritize my relationship over hers. She began recognizing patterns of selfishness and entitlement that had damaged not just her relationship with him, but her relationship with me, and even with her husband. The healing process was slow and often painful, requiring confrontation with decades of poor choices and damaged relationships, but it also created opportunities for growth that wouldn't have been possible without the crisis that forced all of us to examine our values and priorities. 6 months after beginning their community service requirements, both my parents had demonstrated genuine change that surprised everyone involved in their rehabilitation process. Marcus had completed financial counseling and was managing his personal budget responsibly for the first time in decades. Patricia had become one of Sunset Manor's most dedicated volunteers, often staying late to comfort residents who were struggling with health problems or family conflicts. Their transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it represented authentic progress toward becoming the kind of people Grandpa Theodore had hoped they could be throughout their relationship. When I offered them official positions with the foundation, both accepted with humility that marked a dramatic change from their previous attitudes of entitlement and self-importance. The life lesson that emerged from our family's journey through betrayal litigation and eventual redemption reflected Grandpa Theodore's deepest beliefs about the true nature of inheritance and family. Real wealth isn't measured in dollars or property. It's found in the values we pass to future generations and the love we demonstrate through our actions toward others. My grandfather's greatest gift wasn't his money, though that wealth would fund programs that helped thousands of people achieve their dreams. His greatest gift was his example of how to live with purpose, integrity, and compassion, even when surrounded by people who valued material success over character development. Family relationships aren't determined by blood or legal documents. They're built through mutual respect, genuine care, and shared commitment to helping each other become better people. The family I'd found with Grandpa Theodore was based on choice and character, rather than obligation and expectation. As I sat in the Sunset Manor library one evening reading mystery novels to residents who reminded me of my beloved grandfather, I reflected on how our story had transformed from tragedy into hope. The same judge who'd presided over our inheritance trial had become a friend and mentor, often visiting the nursing home to see how foundation programs were improving residents' quality of life. The nursing home residents had become my chosen family people, whose wisdom and life experiences enriched my understanding of what really mattered in relationships between generations. Their stories of immigration survival and achievement reminded me daily of Grandpa Theodore's journey and his commitment to using success for helping others reach their potential. My parents' gradual transformation from greedy plaintiffs into dedicated volunteers represented proof that people could change when faced with consequences for their choices and offered genuine opportunities for redemption. Their journey wasn't easy or comfortable, but it was authentic and sustainable in ways that simple forgiveness could never have achieved. The Theodore Martinelli Foundation grew into a model for effective philanthropy, supporting programs that created lasting change rather than temporary charity. Our scholarship recipients graduated to become teachers, social workers, nurses, and nonprofit leaders who carried forward Grandpa's values into their own communities and relationships. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of success was the peace I found in honoring both justice and compassion, proving worthy of the trust Grandpa Theodore had placed in me, while creating opportunities for healing that transformed our family's legacy from one of dysfunction and greed into one of service and redemption. Standing in the meditation garden that had once been our fishing dock watching sunrise over Vineyard Sound, where Grandpa had taught me about life and love, I understood that true inheritance is about carrying forward the best of what we've received, while adding our own contributions to the wisdom and compassion that future generations will need to build better lives and stronger communities. Have you ever experienced a situation where family members showed their true colors during difficult times? How did you handle the challenge of balancing justice with forgiveness when dealing with people who betrayed your trust? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like, subscribe for more inspiring stories about overcoming family challenges, and share it with anyone who might need encouragement about standing up for their values when facing opposition from unexpected sources. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovering that sometimes the family we choose through our actions and values is stronger than the family we inherit through blood and obligation. Remember that your character and choices define your legacy more than any inheritance ever could.